Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about the Sabrent USB 3.0 4-bay 2.5 inch hard drive / SSD docking station. That's a mouthful. The gist of it is that this little station here accepts 4 2.5 inch SATA drives, hard drives or SSDs, and combines them all to be accessible through one USB 3.0 port. This particular model though has a built-in hardware RAID controller, which is cool. And if you don't know what RAID is, well, you're in luck because I made a video on it. Go watch it, or watch something better, whatever. So let's kind of just go over the basic structure here. This top part has a built-in fan, and this metal contact actually delivers power to it. So when you have the top on, the fan turns on, and there's also a button here that you can use to turn the fan on or off. The side is pretty nondescript. I'm pretty sure this bottom here is either the intake or the exhaust for the fan. I can't really figure out if it goes up or down, but whatever. On the back you have the USB 3.0 B connector, your 12 volt input, and speaking of the 12 volt input, this is the most generic ass power supply. I mean, it literally just says power supply. There's no branding on it or anything, but whatever. And then right here is where you flick the switches to set the RAID level that you want to use. And then what you do is you hold down this button while turning the power on. The power is this button here. Wait a minute, and then, well, not like a solid minute, wait a few seconds, and then release it. The RAID controller sets up the drives that are in there with the drive with the RAID level that you've chosen, and theoretically, you're good to go. Nothing on the side. The bottom has this kind of rubber slip resistant type thing. And yeah, also this fan is a standard size, and you can just undo the 4 screws that are in here to replace it if it goes bad. A lot of the Amazon reviews for the non-RAID controller version, so there's a version of this that's just a docking station and only treats the 4 drives as separately. You could set up a software RAID with that if you wanted, but I think the hardware RAID controller version is cooler. But anyway, a lot of the Amazon reviews were complaining that this fan is pretty loud. I don't think it's that loud. I mean, you can definitely hear it, but it's not overwhelming like some of them were making it out to be. So the drives are held in place with this little kind of plastic flap thing here. If I take out one of the drives, you can see that it just kind of pushes up against the drive and pushes it that way to keep it secure. Now, these are pretty thin drives. I think this is about the thinnest that they get, and it holds them pretty secure, except for this one. This one wobbles around a little bit. However, if I put in a thicker drive, let me just grab one, like this one that's slightly thicker, it sort of pushes that flap away, and so now it's not locked in place anymore, and now it's super wobbly. And the only thing really holding the drive in is the SATA connector itself, which I can't really get on camera, but it feels solid enough. You know, if I get this in there, and you know, the drives aren't going to fall out or anything, so fair enough. I just wouldn't move it around too much, especially if you're using spinning hard drives, and especially if it's turned on. That would be a bad idea. So that bugs me a little, but just kind of be careful of that. Let's pop into the manual real quick. There's not a whole lot super unexpected in here. It shows you that this is all separate pieces. It shows you all the things. It shows you the LEDs in the front. We'll get into the LEDs. These LEDs are janky. Because I had to plug it in, although that's not what the power supply looks like. You know, typical stuff. Yeah. Power button for the fan, power button for the station itself. The weird thing is the fan is completely independent from the power for the station itself, so you can actually turn the drives off and leave the fan on. Why you would do that, I don't know, but it's a thing. I guess it was just easier to make that way. If no drives are plugged in, all lights will be red. When the drives are inserted, it'll illuminate blue. Again, we'll get into that a little bit because these yeah. Okay, so right here, this is the juicy bit. There's nothing else. Oh, this tells you how to set up a RAID. This says hold the RAID switch for 5 seconds and turn it on sometime in that time. That doesn't work reliably for me. For me, I found that you have to press the little RAID button, count to 3, then press the power button, then count to 3 again, and then let it off, and then it'll set it up how you want it. And then here's your typical troubleshooting information. So right here, this is the meat of the matter, and this is also kind of where the problems with the way the manual words things kind of start. You see this line here? The switch order from right to left is 1, 2, 3, 4. So that means on the back of this thing, this far right dip switch is actually number 1. But in the manual, you'll see that they have numbered it from left to right. So that's confusing. And instead of just using like pictures or the words on or off or something, they use high and low. So, for example, if you wanted to set it in RAID 0, you'd switch switches 1, 2, and 3 to high or up. But 1, 2, and 3 would actually be the far right ones, so you'd do that. Oh, and this fourth switch doesn't do anything, at least as far as the manual says. It literally says number 4 switch does not affect a RAID setup, and there's nothing else in this manual about what that switch does. So as far as you can tell, that switch literally doesn't do anything. It's weird. Okay, so that's confusing. But now we're going to get a little bit technical here. So again, if you're not 100% familiar with RAID, go watch my video or find a better one. Whatever. So this is how it describes RAID 3. RAID 3 is similar to RAID 5, except it splits the data up a little bit differently. But the point is that it has parity. And I don't remember if it's distributed or dedicated parity, but whatever. You'll notice that the description does not mention parity at all. That's concerning. Now we go on to its description of RAID 5, and it says disk block level striping with dedicated parity. That's not RAID 5. If this description is accurate, this is RAID 4, which is dumb because RAID 4 is... Don't use RAID 4. So either this is a mistranslation, or they're lying to you about what RAID 5 is. The rest of this is, pretty self-explained. Although they call it RAID clone. It's RAID 1. I mean, even on the advertising for the thing, it says on the box that it supports RAID 1, but in the manual they call it RAID clone. Whatever, it's RAID 1. This cancel and reset one, you have to do that. If you want to change the RAID level, you have to set it to this first, so that sort of clears the RAID controller, and then it will mount each of the 4 drives independently, so you can do that. Although it also has this for separately reading them. I don't know, whatever. Large or JBOD. So what that does is it combines all the disks into one, but it doesn't spread the data across them. It just tacks them each onto the end of each other. This is pretty much what you would want to use if you have if you don't have multiple of the same capacity drives, because using different capacities of drives in RAID will mean that you waste space on the bigger drives because they'll all limit themselves to the lowest space drives. So like if this was a 30 gig drive and these were 60 gig drives, and I wanted to put them in, say, RAID 1, it would only use 30 gigs of these 3 drives. That's not ideal. The downside, of course, is that because it doesn't spread the data across the drives, you could have, say that you have enough data to kind of fill these 2 drives, but then these 2 drives could just be sitting there doing nothing. And then if this drive fails, well, all the data on that's gone. And I'm pretty sure you can still get the data that was on here. I'm not really 100% sure. I guess it depends upon the particular setup, but that was one of the first things that I noticed sort of reading this and getting familiar with it. I'm gonna show you later that it must actually be using some kind of parity with RAID 3 because of the storage space that it shows up as, but we'll get into that. I need to reset the camera up here a little bit, so 1 minute. Alright, so I've been playing with this thing for a while, and there's a huge catch with using this thing that I want to demonstrate. So I have here a simple RAID 1 array, meaning these two drives are just copies of each other. I just set it up so it's not even formatted yet. So I can go in and format this. Let's use exFAT just because that's compatible with basically everything. Click erase. Okay, cool. So now I have a nice formatted RAID 1 array. 500 gigs of space because these are two 500 gig hard drives that are mirrored to each other. And I can go in and let's just find a large file here, say this one, and copy it to the array. And you can see here it starts copying it, no problem. Now the whole point of a RAID array is tolerating disk failure. So if I simulate a disk failure by yanking out a drive here, you can see it doesn't phase it a bit. That's cool. The data is still accessible, it's still writing to it, never even notice. What you have to look at to see if you've had a drive failure is to look at the LEDs on the front. Oh, look at this. This little flap just kind of broke on me. Well, that's... You're watching this live, folks. That's concerning. Oh, Jesus. Now it's... Well, guess I'm going to have to fix that. Anyway, so the other thing is that you can see these drives are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4 left to right. The LEDs are 1, 2, 3, 4, no, 4, 3, 2, 1, wait a minute. Yeah, 4, 3, 2, 1 top down. Not what you'd expect. The other thing about these LEDs is they kind of mush together. You got to look at it from just the right camera angle. But that's all. That's all whatever. Although that's not good. Okay. Well, moving on with what I was originally going to talk about. The thing that I have noticed about this thing is it doesn't do any data reconstruction. So what you would normally expect from a RAID controller is that a drive fails and you yank that drive out, grab another one. So let's just grab another disk off the pile here. And these are all basically identical 500 gig hard drives. So we're not going to run into any compatibility issues. And I plug it in. Once I find the SATA port. I plug it in the right way around. And you can see, first of all, it just completely kills it. But I've done this before. In a minute, it should come back up. And it doesn't merge the new disk with the array. In fact, this is funny. This disk was from earlier. I had this thing formatted as RAID 10 with 4 drives that I was screwing around with. So that drive must have come from that array. But it doesn't do any recognition that that drive is not part of the current array. What you'd expect a RAID controller to do is see that drive and automatically take the data that's on this disk and just start copying it over to this disk, because that's the whole point. Now, I'm not too 100% concerned with that because this is just a consumer grade, not really a toy, but it's not an enterprise grade RAID controller, so I'll cut it some slack from that. It just means that you'll have to manually rebuild the array yourself because you saw that we could still access the data. So you still got nice, good fault tolerance with RAID 1 and RAID 10. Now, of course, if you put them in RAID 0, you're not going to get any fault tolerance, but you're not supposed to with RAID 0, so whatever. I've tested it, and you do get, the speed boost that you would more or less request. And maybe I'll tack on some benchmarks to the end of this video, depending on how long this goes. Or I'll just add them to the description or something, whatever. But, okay, so that's not, a huge capital sin. And in fact, if I take the disk that was originally in this, I think it was this one, and put it back, it should pop back up. And boom, there we are. And you can see with the LEDs. Now, I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera, but the second LED, so blue means it's fine. When these two had just been formatted and hadn't been touched, these two LEDs were pure blue, right? But now this second LED is like kind of blinking red. And the only thing the manual says about that is that if there's a problem setting up the RAID, that it'll blink red and fail. But when I tested this with RAID 10 earlier, the drive popped back up and was starting to be used just fine. What I did is I had a benchmark running, and I would sit here and unplug and plug in the drive, and you could see the speed drop down and go back up in line with what you'd expect with losing a drive from a RAID 10 array, because that's partially RAID 0, so you're supposed to get a speed increase unless you lose a drive. And I could sit there and pop it back in and out, and the benchmark, it didn't phase it. So, I don't know. The manual really needs to be added onto, or somebody needs to go through it and clear up some confusion. I'm going to take a look at that flap, because that's concerning. Well, since I'm taking this thing apart anyway, I figured I could show you the circuit board, and there's really nothing to it. It looks like a circuit board. I couldn't tell you and then your 4 SATA ports right there. This is the connector that goes up to the LEDs and stuff on the front. I gotta figure out if this plastic bit can come out somehow so I can look at that flap that just broke. Alright, so I was able to get this top piece apart. It looks like this is held in with some clips. So you just kind of poke a screwdriver in there and carefully, push them out of the way, and this thing pops out. And this way we get a good look at how the little flaps work. There's just some springs right there that hold this little door in, and I guess this spring that was here just fell out or something. So here's the flap and the spring, so I'm going to try and put that back together the way it's supposed to be real quick. Oh, I see what they're doing. So the inside of this spring has that one little wire going in it, and the end of this flap is bifurcated like that, so it's comes up with the plastic and, come on, focus, springs it like that. Okay. Alright, so I've gotten it back together, and I think I see what happened. This spring is right next to this magnet, which is the magnet that holds the top assembly for the fan on. And you can see that there's a spot missing. Well, that's because that's where the power connector is for the fan itself. Which also, it must be a magnet, and it's already got a bunch of little metal filings on it. That's concerning. So that's, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. But that also makes me wonder if you can't wind these springs tighter to make these flaps hold drives a little bit better. But this was incredibly fiddly to get back in, so let's just pop this back together and go on with what I was originally talking about. So putting this back together, here's another thing I find concerning. The board is held in with these 2 screws right here, and I've got it back in correctly. There's this little stand right here that is pushing up against the bottom of this ribbon cable, which goes to the LEDs and the power and everything. Not a fan of that. That seems like it could cause undue stress, especially because these aren't even tightened down right now. And if I tighten them down, even just to the point of resistance, the bend is already board is already bending a little bit, and I don't like that. Alright, so back to our regularly scheduled whining. I have set up a RAID 5 on this thing using 3 drives, which is the minimum, and I can tell that it's at least doing something right. You can see that the listed capacity here is 1 terabyte. These are 3 500 gig drives each for a total of 1.5 terabytes, but you're going to lose 1 drive's worth of capacity to Parity in RAID 3 or RAID 5. It does the same thing with when I put this in RAID 3. So even though the manual doesn't mention parity for RAID 3, it must be doing something. But my concern with this is what I did to try and figure out whether the manual's description of dedicated parity was correct, in which case this would not be RAID 5, this would be RAID 4, or if it was just a misprint. If I fire up, well, first of all, let's format this thing. So format it. All right, done. Let's just fire up a disk benchmark here. And let's do just a mild stress test. Pick just the root of the RAID 5 volume, open. All right. So this write speed, and in a minute you'll see the read speed, is pretty much what I would expect from having two of these drives striped together, basically. The thing is, and I'm not sure how well this test is going to go when I do it now. I can take out, when I've done this test before, one of these drives can be safely unplugged and plugged back in, no problem, but the other two cannot. So let's see if I can reproduce it now. So if I undo this, oh, I think it finished anyway. Okay, well look, the nothing happened, right? It got ejected, or I took out the disk. The OS didn't even phase it, right? So let's just go into, not Launchpad, let's go into Finder and just like copy, I don't know, a bunch of large crap to this array. All right, so these are just a bunch of giant ISOs. It's doing it no problem. I plug this disk back in. Bam. Now let's take out one of the other ones. And it freezes up, see? Now if I plug it back in, it might pick it back up. Yeah, see, it froze up. And the same thing will happen if I undo the other one. That only makes sense to me if this disk, the one that I can unplug and plug back in, no problem, is the only one acting as parity. Yeah, you can see right there. It crashed. That, I might be wrong, but to me that suggests that this drive is acting as parity, and these other two are the ones holding the actual data, which is RAID 4, not RAID 5. And RAID 4 is a much, much worse setup because now you've only got one disk that can fail with no consequences. And here's the other thing. Because this station does not seem to do any data reconstruction or rebuilding of its own, and I can't find any software from Sabrent that you might, hook up to this thing to control it better, that makes using parity completely pointless. The entire purpose of parity is to reconstruct data in the event of data loss, either a whole drive failure or a sector error or something like that. If you're not going to be doing any data reconstruction, then there's no point in using parity, like at all. So especially with something like this that looks like it's actually RAID 4 and not RAID 5, because this parity disk will never get used for anything because it's not doing its own data reconstruction, you've basically got two drives in RAID 0 with the third drive just wasting power going, I'm helping, the whole time.
I'm a brick!
So, WTF, And just to kind of prove that it's not, doing anything, did anything actually get copied? No, it did not. So let's just kind of, okay, fine, whatever. We'll just copy some more. I'm going to end up rebuilding this anyway. So just copy some more drives. or I'm sorry, let's copy one thing, right? We go copy, just copy it into here. Replace. Okay, so let's simulate a drive failure. Whole thing, freaks out. Might be okay. What you would expect to happen is that it comes back up and shows the data, but now it would be operating much more slowly because the RAID controller would have to be using the parity information and the data remaining to reconstruct it in the meantime. But as you can see, it just comes up as an uninitialized, it comes back up as a completely uninitialized disk. And if I pop in, some other, like this is a different disk. This may or may not have been used as an array in the past before, but what you would expect to happen is that I pop this in and the RAID controller starts rebuilding and moving the data back over to the disk, and eventually the whole thing comes back up and everything's fine. That's what should happen, or at least what you would expect to happen. So if I plug this different disk in place of the one that we simulated a failure on, let's see what happens. Any day now. Well, nothing happens. Maybe it will in a second, but what should happen is that original array will come right back up, and I can go into Finder here, and that Windows 10 ISO that I popped on there should be on there. And look, nothing's even coming back up. If I turn the whole station off and then back on, yeah, it just comes back up as an uninitialized array. So again, this makes using parity completely pointless on this thing. The entire purpose of parity is data reconstruction. And if the RAID controller is not doing any data reconstruction, then there's no point in having it use parity. So the station isn't completely useless. I think it is for RAID 5 and RAID 3, unless Sabrent is going to tell me, oh, actually you do this to initiate data recovery, in which case, why isn't it in the manual? But for something like RAID 0, you could set up a pretty high-speed sort of swap space for large files that don't need to be backed up permanently to anything. One thing about RAID 0, though, with this particular station, obviously RAID 0 doesn't have any fault tolerance whatsoever, but you'll notice that I'm using regular spinning hard drives. I don't think, and I could be wrong on this, but by my math, there would be a point in using more than two, possibly 2 or 3 SSDs in RAID 0 on this thing, because it plugs into your computer via USB 3. The maximum bandwidth, the maximum theoretical bandwidth of USB 3 is 5 gigabits a second, which works out to something like, 625 megabytes a second. In fact, let's just 5 divided by 8. Yeah, 625 megabytes a second. No, megabits a second, excuse me. Right? Whatever. The point is that even one SATA SSD can already hit speeds that are matching. Yeah, this would be 625 megabytes a second. Because, okay, so even a single SATA SSD is already pushing that, right? This is a 2012 MacBook Pro with its own SATA-based SSD, and if I launch this speed test and change it to the internal drive on this thing, this is a what would it be now? This is an 8-year-old SSD, right? And it is still hitting 450-ish, 443 megabytes a second read and write. That is already almost hitting the limit of USB 3.0. You put 2 of those in RAID 0, and you're theoretically doubling that read and write speed. You've already saturated what the USB 3 interface can even handle. Now, random read writes are always a lot slower, so maybe throw in a third one. But putting 4 SSDs in RAID 0, I don't think there would be any point to it, because at that point the USB port wouldn't be able to keep up with it anyway. But for spinning hard drives, you can get the most out of it that way. RAID 1 would also be useful on this thing because, as I demonstrated before, it does have fault tolerance. So if you're using your RAID array and one of the drives fails, you saw earlier you still got access to your data, right? And here I have 4 disks in RAID 10, which is a combination of, it's 2 sets of drives in RAID 0 that are mirrored together. So that gives me a little bit of speed advantage and fault tolerance. I could lose up to 2 of these drives, depending on which 2 it are, and still have access to the data on this thing, which, you know, would get me through until I restore from a backup or something. And that's the thing. If this station, as far as I can tell, would be great for RAID 0, 1, or 10, and making sure that you don't lose the data that's on here if a drive fails. Remember, RAID in and of itself does not count as a backup, okay? It's an availability solution. Now, you can use a RAID array like this as one of your backup locations, but don't consider the fact that it's RAID an additional backup step in and of itself. You understand? This is to keep you from losing access to your data while you're going and getting your backups or whatever. The only catch is, after you've gotten your backups ready or backed up the data that's on here somewhere else, and then gotten a replacement drive, you're going to have to rebuild the array yourself. You're going to have to put the new disk in, clear the RAID, reset the RAID, and then copy the files back over. So you have to play RAID controller in that case. But that does give this station some use of fault tolerance. Okay. Another thing, if you're using solid state drives, the fan may or may not be necessary. I can't really find a utility that can show the individual drive temperatures on this thing. But if you're using hard drives, you're definitely going to want to use the fan because they get pretty toasty. And I told you earlier that the fans aren't that loud. So what I'll do is I'll eject this and just bring the fan up to the camera. Okay. So, fan's not on. Turn the fan on. Like I said, you can hear it, but yeah, turn it back off. Turn it back on. Yeah. Also, probably shouldn't be handling this while the drive's alive, but whatever, it's not being written to. So, that's my sort of initial impressions of this thing. I'm waiting to hear back from Sabrent to see if they're addressing first of all, the inconsistencies in the manual about what RAID 5 is, and also why you would even use RAID 3, 4, or 5, any parity at all, on a station like this that can't do any data reconstruction. I can't find any software by Sabrent to do that. Maybe it's out there and it's just not in where it should be. But yeah, so I'm going to put this thing in RAID 10, and I think I'll use it for like time machine backups or something. I don't really do anything cooler than that right now, but we'll see what the future holds. And if something changes, I'll let you guys know. Thanks for watching.